Hello. We'll wait a few minutes for others to join.
Yeah, the email said conversation beforehand, but I didn't know whether that meant show up 5 minutes early or show up on time or don't show up or what. So
Sorry, I was muted for part of it. What were you saying?
Yeah, back in the email, it was, I think the email announcement said, just like when it was non-virtual, there'll be time for quick conversation before the talk starts, but I wasn't sure if that meant, show up 15 minutes early, I just got here right before you, or whether that meant just, show up on time and we'll chit chat. Or not, who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll see how promptly people come. Usually we begin at 5 after like
That's true.
3:35 or so. Probably we'll end up doing the same here.
Well, historically that was because one block of people had to walk to a different building, but we'll see whether that sticks, I guess.
Where are you, Sarah?
I'm actually in Colorado right now. Normally I'm, in the CS department at BU. I mean, I'm still in the CS department at BU, but I'm not physically there.
And the rest of you, where are you at BU?
So I'm an incoming 1L, or I guess started 1L, but I've been working.
What does that mean?
What's that?
What's a 1L?
Oh, sorry, a first year law student.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yep. I've been working in tech lobbying in DC for the last 4 years, working mainly on privacy and 230 and those kinds of issues. So.
Oh, interesting.
I'm very interested in what you have to say.
What companies were you working for?
Some of them Etsy, Eventbrite, Pinterest. We did a little bit of work for Intel. They don't do a ton on the front, and then Verizon Media, which is Yahoo, Tumblr, all those for Huffington Post. So kind of a wide swath, but it was exciting.
Cool. Yeah, that's an interesting experience. It's a lot of work to dig into these laws.
It is.
It's just getting harder. Mayank, where are you at? If I'm pronouncing your name at all correctly.
Yeah, I'm Mayank. I'm in the computer science department at BU, and I work in cryptography, among other things.
Cool.
Yeah, I guess I should say I'm a PhD student. Mayank's my advisor, so he's a real professor, very fancy.
Do you also work on cryptography stuff, or do you do something else?
Me, I do cryptography with mostly applied cryptography. I'm also trying more to get into this interdisciplinary area of law and computer science. So it's very exciting.
Cool. Quinn, where are you at?
Hey, I'm a student over at BU Law. I was in the technology law clinic with Andy Sellers last year. So I like these talks. They're always really interesting.
Cool. Nina, good to see you.
To see you. Thank you for being our first speaker for this academic year.
It's uphill from here.
No. And Azar, I think I saw Azar there, right?
Right here.
Hey, Azar, how are you doing? Are you feeling still any side effects from?
No, that's long past, except for adding a few pounds, but that's okay, I guess.
Okay.
It's all good.
I read about the interview that you had with the BU News. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
That's something.
I want to forget it, so don't remind me.
Okay. I won't.
So
nice
hi, everybody.
Stack of books behind you.
See. Oh, that's the new building behind me. You're asking about the picture?
I know, I'm just teasing. Looks good.
I think it looks better than my kitchen in the back there. So.
Yeah. Is this the BU library that's behind me? I've been here long enough to know.
I
think this is the CES building, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the Psi Performance Center, which also has a bunch of classrooms in it, I think.
Yeah. All right.
It's the one right across the street from the building I would normally be in.
Well, I'm representing today. Well, let's do it. Proud to be you. So what about some of the rest of you? Sydney, where are you in the BU space?
Yeah, hi, I'm at BU Law. I'm a first year.
Cool. Who else? Jenny?
Hello, yeah, I'm BU Law, also in my third year.
Awesome. Gabe, where are you from?
Howdy, I'm new in the computer science department and Hariri, and I do some kind of intersection between policy and human beings and privacy stuff and crypto.
Ah, awesome. Well, I'm glad to meet you because I'm interested in similar things. Alexis, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm a PhD student in the Emerging Media Studies department.
What do you work on?
And I work on surveillance issues and privacy design work. And how we can,
Sweet.
Yeah.
Cool. Also interested in similar things. Quinn?
I think I mentioned earlier, but I'm over at BU Law.
Oh, you got rearranged. All right, cool, thanks. Marika?
I'm a second year PhD student in computer science, studying like data privacy and cryptography type stuff.
Awesome. Lots of privacy people here. Cool. Allie?
I'm a research professor in computer science working on formal methods for crypto, mechanizing proofs about crypto on the computer.
Cool. And Michael?
I am a professor in the law school, and I will see you on Friday and Saturday at our conference.
Awesome. I sent my talk over not too long ago, today. So it'll be fun. Nice to meet you too. Kayla?
I'm a student at the law school. I'm in my third year.
Awesome. And the mysterious RA1. I hope you're a research assistant and you're looking for work and you're very good at computer science.
RA1 says his microphone is not working.
Ah, sneaky, sneaky, sneaky. By the way, yeah, this is actually a good moment to say if any of the computer science students are interested in empirical work and research assistant work, I am currently looking for a research assistant. So do please send me an email. It'd be good to chat. Caitlin? You're muted, but it's good to see your face.
Thanks, I'm hiding here. Caitlin Fennessy, I'm the research director at the International Association of Privacy Professionals.
Ah, cool beans. Cool beans.
Thanks for letting me join.
And the nameless person who just turned on his video. Not sure who you are. Tiffany, I've been wanting to meet you. I've Twitter met you, but I've not real life met you.
Yes, I know. We've definitely exchanged messages, and unfortunately, we also can't meet again today. But good to be here. I'm Tiffany Lee. I'm a visiting clinical assistant professor at the law school, and a lot of my research also concerns privacy. I look forward to this paper.
Awesome. Do you want to finish the room here or get started, or do you guys, who's in charge of this show?
So why don't you go ahead and, since you have the participants list, we'll follow your order if you don't mind.
So should I just briefly introduce Garrett before we start?
Sure, but why don't we first finish the introductions of other folks? We can do them last.
Oh, I didn't hear that. I'm sorry. Sure.
Yeah, I'm what's his name? Jocelyn, haven't heard from you. There's like 2 more left, I think.
Hi. Yeah, great to meet you. So I am the new assistant director at the BU MIT Technology Law Clinic. So we're, a free legal service for the student innovators at BU and MIT. And our clinic clients often come to us with privacy questions, privacy compliance questions, and yeah, it's generated my interest.
Cool beans. And I think the last person is Ari.
Yes, hi. Ari Trachtenberg, lurking professor from ECE department, working security, privacy, and in that spirit, won't say anymore.
Cool. Any last people? All right, let's get started. I guess Nina is.
I'll do a very quick introduction. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the first talk of the academic year, and I'm excited that this also marks Socilo's official, the Socilo Institute for Ethics and Global Economy at the Questrom School of Business here at BU to officially join the Cyber Alliance together with the Faculty of Law and Computer Science. So very excited about that. And when we were thinking about who are the speakers we would like to suggest, you know, I didn't have to think for too long, because Garrett is an amazing colleague of mine in the marketing department. He joined the same year that I joined BU, so in 2018. I think I was half a year before him. And at the Socilo Institute, what we are interested in is thinking about all things ethics when it comes to the business world. And part of that is how companies should be thinking about ethics of technology, and questions such as privacy and disclosure from both sides, how business perceive it, what they do about it, their responsibilities, but also understanding how consumers and those targeted, how they experience it, what their preferences are, what it means for their behavior are questions that we think are important and that we are interested in contributing to. And so, so as I said, so Garrett was the first person that I thought of when I was thinking of speakers, because he is working in the digital marketing space, doing lots of work on consumer privacy issues and ad effectiveness research, and he uses large-scale experiments to measure how those ads work and how much they work. And when it comes to privacy, he has done quite a lot of stuff on the European GDPR, and I guess that's what you will be talking about primarily today. And I just wanted to point out that he has on his website that for his work, he has been awarded the Paul Green Award and has been finalist for the John D. Little Award and the Gary Lillian Award. These are all, or prize, these are all quite impressive awards and prizes within the marketing community. So just an example, the Paul Green Award that he did get awarded is for the best article published in the Journal of Marketing within always the last calendar year. So it's an annual award and it's highly competitive. And the Journal of Marketing is one of the flagship journals in marketing. So there are lots of, so he's very smart. He's working on interesting questions, and there is much more to come. And I'm very happy that I can count him as one of our colleagues. And without further ado, Garrett, the stage is all yours.
Oh, thank you, Nina, for a very, very kind introduction. This is also my first time participating with this group. I kind of found out about you last year, and it just happened to coincide with my teaching, so I wasn't able to come. That and the world was ending. So I do hope to participate a little bit more regularly and get to know you. What else can I add about myself? I guess I'm Canadian. I did my undergrad at University of British Columbia and my PhD at Northwestern in economics. And then I switched to marketing. I spent my first 3 years at the University of Rochester and then went to Kellogg back at Northwestern for a couple years. And now I've been here. This is the start of my 3rd year. So for any assistant professors out there, word of advice, don't go to 3 institutions prior to tenure. That's the road less traveled by for a reason. But yeah, my work looks at the effectiveness of online marketing and also does a lot of work on privacy issues. So I've done work on the value of a cookie and trying to understand how the industry evaluates this private information that kind of makes the world go round online. But I also have research on the GDPR. So today I'm going to tell you about one of these papers, and it's the impact that the GDPR has had on market concentration. And we also have a paper looking at the impact that GDPR has had on web traffic and e-commerce revenue. So this paper is with Scott Shriver at the University of Colorado, as well as Sam Goldberg at Kellogg, and Sam's just an exceptionally talented PhD student. So today the main research question is, can privacy policy hurt competition? And there's a number of reasons why we might expect there to be some trade-off between the two. The first is on the consumer side. If we ask consumers to consent to a list of firms with whom you're going to share data, then that creates an incentive for that list to be both short and to include lists of firms that the consumers recognize. And both these forces would be anti-competitive. Now, on the firm side, which is where we're going to focus on today, the traditional explanation for regulation in general is that if there's economies to scale, it's going to mean that larger firms are going to have more resources to comply with a law. And so that's going to advantage larger firms and create barriers to entry for new firms as well. Now, what hasn't been emphasized, but what we're going to try to convince you with this paper, is that there's another mechanism where, in a business-to-business sense, if firms are in relationship with data vendors, and the regulation, the privacy regulations, puts pressure on firms to limit the partnerships that they have, they're going to be more likely to retain their large vendors over their small vendors, simply because the large vendors are probably large because they have better products. But you could also imagine there's other explanations, going back to the last point I made, potentially the larger firms are better compliant with the law too. So that's where we're going. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be studying the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a landmark privacy policy and a leading example to the world. We are going to use its May 25th, 2018 enforcement deadline as an event study to study its effects. Now, the GDPR has many elements, and many of these elements contribute to increasing both the logistical and legal risk, the logistical costs, pardon me, and legal risk of personal data processing. And this is going to have important consequences for the web. So in this paper, we're going to study the technology vendor industry that provides an ecosystem for the web to thrive. Specifically, these vendors help websites to monetize themselves with ads, to load and share content, as well as measure and optimize site traffic. But in order to provide these services, many of these vendors are sharing data that the GDPR considers to be personal data. Now, this industry has faced intense regulatory scrutiny, with at least 3 EU countries releasing major reports or statements criticizing the industry, but regulators still have not issued any fines in this area. So to overview our main findings, we find that there's a 15% reduction in vendor use right after the GDPR, and that coincides with a 17% increase in market concentration post-GDPR. So to preview where we're going to go today, I'll first give you a primer on the GDPR, and then talk to you about our data, briefly mention our theory model we use to direct our empirical analysis, and then I'll show you our results on 3 stages. I'll show you the GDPR's effect on vendor use, its effect on concentration of the vendor market, and then finally some evidence of differences by website that helps you understand the incentives that the websites face and how they're responding to the regulation. So before I go into the GDPR primer, I'm an economist, so the fact that I haven't been interrupted on my first slide is kind of a plus, but don't be shy. Don't feel that you need to wait till the end of the talk if you have questions, and we'll just try to keep a good balance and get some good feedback, and I appreciate that. Sarah, do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. So who all are the vendors that you're looking at? Just all tech companies, or some specific sector, or what?
So I'm looking at when you visit a website, your browser interacts with the first-party domain of that website, but it also interacts with the third-party domains of many companies that are providing services. So that's largely Google that's providing services like monetizing through ads, allowing you to analyze your traffic through services like Google Analytics. And even basic things like having site elements, like you might use youtube.com to store your videos. You may use fonts.com to load fonts. This is kind of the wide gamut of services that websites use, and I'm going to look at all of them, but a lot of the focus is going to be on the advertising side.
Okay, thanks.
Great question. Cool. So I'll walk you through the GDPR primer. You know, what's kind of interesting about this work is it really is interdisciplinary because it is very much a policy paper that we're analyzing through an economic lens, but this sort of data that I just mentioned is typically data that is analyzed by computer scientists. And of course, we're discussing this new law, which is from Europe, so it involves law as well. But we are basically marketing professors, so we come to you cap in hand. But I've certainly spent a lot of time reading the GDPR and associated legal advice. So the GDPR is very ambitious. It's kind of a generational shift in privacy policy. And one part of that is pretty expansive definition of personal data to be data that pertains to a unique individual. So that's going to include cookie IDs as well as IP addresses. So it's going to be material for the subject we're going to be looking at today. So it's much more expansive than just your name and your social insurance number, for instance. Now, as I've already mentioned, the enforcement deadline of this law was May 25th of 2018, and we're going to be focusing on the 2018 period for analyzing its effects. Now, the geographic scope is interesting because it targets EU firms, but it also targets non-EU firms that target EU residents. So if you have a company based in the US that is shipping to the EU as well as to the US and Canada, you're going to be under the law for when you're operating with the data of EU residents. And then the other interesting part of the geography of this law is that the enforcement is split in a kind of federal way between country level regulators and EU-wide regulators. And these are details I'm going to show you through data tend to actually matter in how the GDPR is interpreted. And then finally, we're interested in studying this because it affects the 28 countries of the EU, which includes the UK for the purposes of 2018. But this law has informed global regulation in privacy worldwide. So in particular, the US's CCPA, or California's privacy law, as well as Brazil, Japan, and South Korea. Now, one of the key principles of the GDPR is data minimization. And as I walk you through these elements of the GDPR, you'll see that it creates powerful incentives for firms to reduce the amount of data they're using. So on the individual side, individuals gain a lot of data rights, the rights to access, correct, erase, and take their data elsewhere, including to potentially a competitor, as well as the ability to object to processing and the ability to object to decisions based on automated processing. And then on the firm side, there's a lot of responsibilities. The first are the rights-based responsibilities. And this is actually pretty hard for firms as it costs them a lot of money because many firms were not at a place where they had individual consumer databases that could speak to each other. So just the ability of having a consumer come to you and say, I want all the data that you have about me. This is actually reasonably difficult for firms to fulfill. So the rights-based responsibilities has imposed serious costs and adaptations on firms. And then firms also have to audit their data trails. So all the personal data flowing throughout their firms, which if you're a large firm could be a pretty daunting task. They're required to minimize the data that they collect, which is also referred to by data protection by default. They're also required to encrypt or pseudonymize their data, which is referred to as data protection by design. And then there's a requirement for data breach notifications. So if you think that your data has been breached within 72 hours, you need to let the regulator and the consumers know. And then finally, firms need to appoint a data protection officer that sort of serves as a mini regulator within the firm to make sure that these responsibilities are being upheld. So again, I think the takeaway here is that the cost and legal risk of handling personal data has increased significantly post-GDPR. Now, the GDPR is a challenging thing to study in our setting because it actually hasn't really been enforced yet for websites and vendors. So kind of stepping back and thinking about how we get firms to comply with the law in general, we think that there's basically two channels or two levers you can pull. The first is the fine, and the second is the chance of actually getting fined. So in the GDPR, the fine is doing most of the work because the fine is really high. It's up to 4% of global annual revenue, which is significant because it means that you can be fined on the basis of revenue from outside the EU and not just within the EU. And this is doing some work as well to ensure the compliance of international firms, which are very important when it comes to data sharing. But when it comes to the probability of the fine, this is actually going to be pretty low, in part just mechanically, because these regulators are under-resourced. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of people. These cases take time to choose and to investigate. And so for many of these reasons, there hasn't been actually any fines to date in this industry. The GDPR has levered some, there have been fines in the GDPR in general, but not specific to this industry. But that's not to say that everything is happy in this industry. 3 EU country regulators have criticized the industry for not complying with the law. And one specific manifestation of this is that consent is basically the legal basis that should be used for personal data in this setting. And that consent should be opt-in. So the user needs to take a specific examples. You cannot, or sorry, specific action to opt in. You cannot have a pre-check box. So that's what's supposed to be happening. But what is actually happening is that it's opt-out. So effectively, especially circa 2018, if you go to a website, it's going to be loading all these third-party domains prior to asking for consent. And the consent menu is really pushing you towards just press OK and get on with your life, or otherwise, you know, go through a list of more options, and you'll have to take some time to actually opt out of this data sharing. So, you know, one of the problems that we have with this paper, one of the challenges we have in this paper is how are we going to evaluate a policy that's not been enforced? Most past literature on regulatory enforcement has looked at the impact of regulatory actions on firm behavior. So basically we hit the firm over the head and then we see how their behavior changes as a regulator. But in this case, we're going to evaluate the GDPR using the changes in firm choices that it engenders. And we're going to link that to firm beliefs about enforcement. So any questions about the law before I talk a bit about the literature? Okay. So I'll tell you a bit about what the literature's found on the economic side, focusing on the empirical literature. This Judgin and Wagman papers are really compelling and really alarming because they show a reduction of about 25% in tech venture investment post-GDPR relative to the US. Our other paper on this shows a reduction in measured site traffic and revenue that we're getting through about 1,000 firms using Adobe Analytics. Many of this appears to be due to consent, but it also appears that it's harder to market to consumers post-GDPR. The Godinho de Matos paper also talks about the effect of this on marketing, shows that you can use these permissioning campaigns to gain consent of the users, and that can then improve your marketing, but you've added extra costs and frictions to your marketing effectively. The Aridar and co-authors paper shows that there's a reduction of about 12.5% in consumers on online travel companies, and this is due to consent as well. So there is some evidence that the people that do consent are kind of better customers, so that offsets some of the damage there a bit. And then this Pukert and co-authors paper is highly complementary to ours. It essentially shows in the same setting that the GDPR increased competition. Now, some computer science papers, at least some of the first computer science papers in this, looked at also the impact that the GDPR had on third-party cookies, also showing a decline specifically, especially for news sites and private sites. This Sanchez roll-up paper and co-authors is very nice because it finds that most sites are tracking users without waiting for consent. So this is something that complements what we found and also what the Irish regulator complained about last year. And then finally, there's a couple papers showing that firms were changing their privacy policies and cookie consent notices in response to the law. All right, any more questions before I move on to the data? All right, so pushing forward, and again, don't feel free to speak up. So I mentioned briefly kind of what's going on in the data, but let me go through it in a little bit more detail. So when you're visiting your favorite website, your browser is interacting with the first party domain of that website. Like in this case, your browser is interacting with theguardian.com. However, at the same time, your browser is interacting with potentially dozens of third-party domains owned by various vendors that the websites has selected to provide services. So here we see kind of some familiar logos. So we see Twitter is being used, Facebook is here, Yahoo, and then kind of a lot of Google, of course, is kind of always there, and then some other companies that don't have logos. So these are the sort of companies that are being engaged by theguardian.com to be able to principally monetize its website, but also do some other services like social media sharing. Now, kind of stepping back here, if we're trying to understand the impact of the GDPR on data sharing, this is actually a pretty hard thing to study because firms don't really broadcast when they're sharing your personal data, and they typically don't broadcast with whom they're sharing your personal data. So what's kind of nice about this setting is that firms are outsourcing this task to the browser, and so because of that, we get this amazing ability to observe the website's network of vendors they use to accomplish their services. So in order to collect the data, we operate in 3 steps. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to use a VPN service to simulate ourselves as coming from within the EU. Specifically, we're going to say that we're coming from France. Then we use a specialized piece of software developed by a computer scientist at CMU called Tim Liebert. And that program is called WebX-Ray. And that's going to record all the third-party domain interactions that arise from visiting a website. So it's not purely cookies. It's going to be stuff that's initiated through JavaScript as well as HTTP requests. We're going to be able to record basically all the third-party domain interactions that are happening. Now, we repeat this for 28,000 top websites regularly in 2018. And to be a site in our sample, you have to be one of the top 2,000 websites in one of each of 28 EU countries, as well as the US, Canada, and globally. So the intersection of that is 28,000 websites. So now, especially for the non-computer scientists in the room, I want to walk you through in three quick examples, just what's going on here. So in the first example, I'm going to show you the use of personal data via first-party and third-party cookies. So in this case, you visited theguardian.com, and The Guardian puts a cookie on your browser that's ABC123. I'll just bring my little pointer here. And this is going to be useful to theguardian.com to remember you as you walk through the website. So for instance, if you signed into The Guardian and you're a subscriber, this is going to allow The Guardian to remember that fact so that you can explore the Guardian website at your leisure. But this example also shows a third-party cookie. So here, The Guardian has selected Google as an ad vendor to monetize its website and allows Google to interact with the user. Now to do this, the website writes some code that tells the user's browser to interact with doubleclick.net, which is a domain owned by Google. And when your browser visits doubleclick.net, it's going to get a third-party cookie if it doesn't already have one. So notice that the ID here is actually different, EFG456. This is purposeful. The ID is different for 2 reasons. Number 1, doubleclick.net cannot read the first-party cookie that theguardian.com has set. And number 2, doubleclick.net may have placed a cookie on the browser at another website. So for instance, at Macy's.com, which would allow Macy's.com to retarget the user when the user arrives on theguardian.com. But it's also possible to exchange personal information without using a third-party cookie. So here I'm showing you the example of Google Analytics. So as before, we've got theguardian.com using this first-party cookie, but now they've chosen to measure its site traffic using Google Analytics. And so the Guardian writes some code on its website that tells the user's browser to interact with googleanalytics.com. And the form of that interaction is going to allow it to pass on this information. So specifically, the browser is going to visit a very long URL at googleanalytics.com that's going to include a lot of information like the page ID, but it's also going to include the first party identifier. So here's this ABC123 is being passed on through the Guardian, and that can only happen with the Guardian's permission. So it is possible to actually pass on this first party, this personal information without cookies. And then finally, in a third example, it's possible that these third-party domain interactions happen without passing any personal information. So here, the Guardian has decided to work with fonts.com, and they are sending content in the form of fonts to the browser, but they're not using a user ID to in the course of that conversation. All right, any questions? Okay, so to give you a sense of the pre-GDPR baseline, on average, websites were working with 16.3 third-party domains, but this varies a lot. So the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 199. We're going to collapse this to vendors. So vendors are usually the same thing as third-party domains, but sometimes a single vendor like Google is going to use multiple third-party domains to do the same function. So we're going to group those together. So that shrinks a little bit to 14.4. 7.3 of these are using third-party cookies. 92% of websites on average are using first-party cookies. And then one of the things we're doing in this paper is we're trying to categorize these vendors depending on the kind of work that they're doing. So we're able to categorize about 2/3 of these vendors, 8.4 on average. Now, we also augment our data with some data from Alexa to get a sense of who these sites are. So we know that on average, we've got a pretty deep in the list of top websites globally. By construction, we've got the #1 website, which is google.com. The median website is ranked number 58,000, but then we've got some long tail websites, which is just what happens when you're including like the number 2,000 most popular website in Latvia in your sample. We also get data on the share of traffic that a website gets by country and group that up by the share of users coming from the EU. So on average, it's 70%, and this is deliberate because we've constructed our sample to be predominantly websites that are popular among EU visitors. But we do have the whole kind of range here between 0 and 100%. So coming back to this question of what are these web tech vendors and what are they actually doing? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just on the previous slide, so when you kind of have the Alexa rank here of the third-party vendors, like seeing one
it's the
somehow
Alexa
gives me,
rank of the websites.
I see. So there's websites in the sample, not the rank of the third-party domains.
Yes.
I see. Okay, cool.
Thank you for
I have a
clarifying
separate
that.
question.
Yeah, all this data is about websites. Thanks, Gabe. Sure,
Yeah.
Sarah, go ahead.
Separate question, sorry. So most of this I can see how you would have measured. How did you get the EU users share percentage?
Oh, so this is using data from Alexa. So we pinged the Alexa Web Information Service, and they allowed us to provide, they provided this data, which has been very useful.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good question. But all this data is stuff we've collected. And this is stuff from Alexa.
So maybe a follow-up question. The thing that I thought the Alexa rank was, and I'm wondering if you had any inclination of, is when you look at all of these different third-party vendors, how many of them are kind of Google and Facebook and, you know, whatever the smaller version of these things is, I guess like MySpace or whatever, and how much of them are like in the tail of like all the possible websites out there, right? It's like, you know, some super hacky website that somebody's included as a third-party vendor because they need their JavaScript to capitalize their L's correctly or whatever. do you have any sense about like the distribution of who the third-party vendors are?
Yes, I think, you know, the next slide is going to tell you at least by category, and I do know, you know, who is who. It turns out that like Google and Facebook are playing a huge role in these findings, which I'll highlight later. The challenge is like there's a lot of really small atomistic third-party domains that are being connected here, and sometimes it's just like, you know, if you visit the Chicago Tribune, it pings, oh, I forget, but basically like the site of its owner company, as does the LA Times. You know, that's not tremendously interesting. And certainly like a lot of these things are pretty atomistic. They're really small. When we show you the results for market concentration, all the leverage in those results is coming from the big guys because the small ones just basically disappear. So it's a very good question. And as I go on, I think the evidence will piece that picture together for you. Cool. So just going through the categorization, we see that about half or more than half of this is advertising related. So 4.35 of, I guess it was 8.4 is advertising. The next category is a very broad umbrella category for hosting. So this includes web hosts like Amazon Web Services. It also includes web code, like website code, like Google APIs and the jQuery Foundation. Different content hosting like video serving through YouTube or Vimeo, fonts through fonts.com. So this is a kind of a grab bag. Audience measurement, this is basically Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics and a few of the large vendors here. Most websites are using one or two of these companies to help them track their traffic. Social media companies are all companies that you'd recognize. A lot of this is for social media sharing. So be able to retweet an article on Twitter, for instance, but some of it could also be pixel use. Design optimization, and now we're getting to like pretty small categories. This is like an upgraded version of audience measurement. So for instance, the ability to run A/B tests. Security, this is for kind of denying bot attacks. Native ads is a kind of a niche form of advertising. This is basically messaging when you arrive on a website. And then this tiny thing here is privacy compliance. So this is the large vendors like TrustArc that firms are using to help comply with the increasing battery of privacy laws. So that gives you a little bit of sense of the data. Now, I'm not going to walk through the full theory model. I just want to kind of describe what it's being used for. So essentially, we wanted to guide our empirical analysis because this is in some sense descriptive work. So in order to do that, we propose an equilibrium model of the web technology industry, where on one side, you've got differentiated vendors with asymmetric costs. And on the other side, you have a representative website that chooses vendors that improve the revenue. And as I explained before, the way the regulation is going to enter here is you've got a fine amount, which is 4% of your global revenue, multiplied by the probability of the fine. This is going to come from sites' beliefs about the probability that they get fined. And then if that didn't make any sense to you, I think the key comparative statics or the key predictions of this model is that as sites' beliefs about the probability of enforcement are increase, so the chance that we get hit by the regulator increases, we should expect fewer active vendors in equilibrium. We should expect an increase in concentration in the vendor market, and we should find that the high revenue sites cut vendors the most. And I think these are somewhat intuitive. I'll walk through the intuition as I show you the results in more detail. All right, any questions before I launch into the results? Cool. So here's a graph of the evolution of the number of vendors over time. So prior to the GDPR, so we picked data literally in the couple days leading up to the GDPR. We saw that websites were using 14.4 vendors on average. And 1 week later, which is the minimum point in this graph, this falls to 12.4 vendors. So this is a 15% reduction in vendor use, which we refer to as a short run effect for the GDPR. Now, obviously, we would have liked to have collected data beforehand, so a longer pre-period. But we know from auxiliary data and related research that the pre-trend is basically flat. Furthermore, most websites appear to have waited to the last minute to make changes to their website, which is why 3/4 of the drop actually happens within a few days of the enforcement deadline. So if anything, we may be understating the total drop in the number of vendors by gathering data a little bit later than would have been ideal, but we're still seeing a really clear drop that really hasn't been replicated before or since. Now, one thing that's also remarkable with this graph is that this vendor use drop was pretty short-lived, and it erodes by the end of 2018. So this is probably a function of a couple things, and I'll come back to this point. That's probably because this is a very dynamic market that expands over time. But I'm also going to show you some evidence that's consistent with sites' beliefs about enforcement falling over time in the absence of any fines. So there's a lot of questions that typically come up at this point, so I want to try to kind of explain what is and is not going on here. So the first thing is kind of focusing on this big drop that happens in the week around GDPR. So what we think is happening is that websites are revisiting their vendor contracts and making deliberate choices and cutting out a number of their vendors. But we want to rule out some alternative explanations that you may have in your mind. So the first thing we look at is the possibility that it's just vendors that exit. So some vendors sort of said, I'm leaving this party. The GDPR is just too hard. I'm not going to be participating. But it turns out that these vendors turned out to be pretty small. So the largest vendor that exits our data entirely is only on 78 websites, which is a small portion of our sample. Now, a second explanation that might come to mind here is that you probably saw media reports that many websites were blocking EU users. And so in order to address this, we took a list of 1,300 websites that were blocking EU users from O'Connor, and we matched them with our sample, and it turns out there's only 13 of these sites in our data. And we identified another 29 sites that were blocking EU users manually. But one kind of funny thing here is that only 10 of these 42 sites that were blocking EU users cut their third-party domain use below 10, 1 week after the GDPR. So one thing that we noticed is that effectively many of these websites were appearing to block EU users, but perhaps due to just inexperience or just incompetence of their engineers, it was still most of the third-party domain interactions were still firing. And then finally, one concern that could really mess with our data collection and interpretation is that sites were very politely waiting for consent, like they're they actually were supposed to. And in order to look at that, we looked at the 10% of websites that we know are using an external privacy extension, and we find no change in websites that are loading 0 third-party domains. So if they're waiting for consent, we should see nothing firing, and in fact, there's basically no change in that. And as I said before, this is supported by computer science research suggesting that most websites set at least one cookie without consent, as well as the Irish Data Protection Authority also found that this was pretty prevalent among websites. Any questions at this stage? Okay. So then this other question is, why does it just go back to what it was before? So I mentioned before that our favorite explanation is a combination of the technology evolving and falling beliefs about the probability of enforcement. But there's some other candidates that we want to rule out. So one thing is maybe it's possible that there's just a big entrant that entered the market and took a lot of market share. And it's not really that story. So we looked at vendors that enter and exit. So about 2% of the ties in our data are from vendors that exit the market. A little over 2% are from vendors that enter the market. And so there's almost no net entry here on the vendor side that's driving this. Now, another question we often get is, was it just the case that these websites added back the vendors that they dropped the week after the GDPR? And so we looked at the new vendor ties that were formed after May 25th. And some of that was readoption. So 1/3 are vendors that the site was using prior to the GDPR, but actually 2/3 are new ties. So that's, to me, was actually pretty astounding that quite so many of those were new ties. But it does suggest that it's more than just this next explanation, which is that maybe it's just that these vendors were learning to comply. So a couple kind of things to say about this. The first is, as I already mentioned, the EU regulators have generally found that the industry, at least at this time, was not complying with the GDPR. So they're not really learning to comply. Now, there's this industry framework, the IAB's Transparency and Consent Framework for Compliance, which basically passes along consent signals to the various vendors. And this is pretty straightforward. Like, it's not rocket science to grab and interpret these compliance signals. So certainly there was some work that they needed to do, and they probably needed to get some legal advice. But it's not purely the case that these vendors kind of learned to comply, and therefore, you know, the end of 2018 reflects the equilibrium of the GDPR being enforced. Questions?
I guess I have a question that I'll try to figure out how to phrase. So this last point, you're saying that the steps people need to go through in order to comply are reasonably straightforward, but generally it is found that the industry is largely not complying. But I guess I find it hard to square just an EU regulators generally find the industry does not comply. I find it hard to square that with the graph where, like, it could very well be that, you know, let's suppose the 1/3 of readopted vendors did learn to comply. Like, why is that ruled out in that sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to get a bit into the nitty gritty, there's a certain amount of ambiguity about this. So the industry has worked within that ambiguity to create this this framework that does some things really well, like transmitting consent signals. And that part is reasonably straightforward for them to comply with. But the EU regulator has made it very clear that websites should not be sending computers, browsers, or sending personal information about consumers to these third-party vendors prior to getting consent. So in some sense, what should have happened back here is this basically should have like dropped to 0 or dropped to close to 0. And the fact that it did not drop to 0 gives us some data to analyze. Now, you know, the other bit of messiness about this is that, so for instance, the French regulator has said, and the Irish one too, has basically said, like, yes, this is not really under compliance, but we're going to give you an additional grandfather period to send this information out to third parties without people's explicit opt-in consent. So for the Irish regulator, it's until basically next month, and for the French regulator, it's actually kept being pushed into the future. So we're not exactly sure when that's going to kick in. So there is some, you know, on the basis of these grandfathering in systems, websites may say, I'm just going to use, you know, tacit consent is good enough because they actually get a lot of money from sharing this information. So I'm not really in too much of a hurry to comply. It's really messy, but does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes. Can I ask one more really fast one?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Do you have a feel for whether, for the variance? So is this every vendor dropped to, or sorry, every website dropped 2 vendors, or is this half the websites dropped all their vendors and the other half stayed the same as they were?
Yeah, so there is some variance. I mean, there's definitely some, so what I'm gonna show you at the last part of results, I think is some really cool decompositions of who drops websites the most, or sorry, which websites drop vendors the most. And I think what's really cool there is that it shows you some very interesting economics. There's really responding to the incentives that they face. So on average, you see some pretty cool things, but as you say, there's a fair amount of variance. And some of that is just variance that naturally happens when you visit the homepage of a website. So for instance, if you visit the New York Times today and they don't have a video on their website, and you visited tomorrow and they do have a video on their website, you may get some new vendors. But on average, I think these patterns are pretty cool.
Thank you.
Great questions. All right, so I've walked you through some of this morass, so I appreciate your patience with this bizarre state of the world that we're in into the GDPR. So I want to come back to this drop in that we observed in the short run here of 15%, and I want to break it down by category. So on average, we see a reduction of 15%. For categorized vendors, it's a little larger. The largest part, though, is advertising. So advertising is falling by about a quarter in the week post GDPR. Most of the rest is decreasing by about 10%. And then what's kind of interesting, and I apologize for this bar that keeps showing up here, this is the privacy compliance category. So this is the one category you'd expect to grow as a result of the GDPR. So it's probably good news that it's growing, albeit, pretty small amount. All right, so now that I've given you the sense that the vendors have reduced the number of vendors, sorry, the websites have reduced the number of vendors, I want to talk about the impact on competition. And I'm not going to observe any information about pricing. I'm just going to observe which website uses which vendor. And so I'm going to talk about market structure. So the concentration of the market, the size of the largest firms relative to the smallest firms. So big picture, the exercise is as follows. We're trying to understand, do larger vendors get a larger share of the smaller pie post-GDPR? So this is really, we're looking at results in a relative sense, because basically all firms are worse off in an absolute sense in terms of the number of websites that use them post-GDPR. And so again, we're trying to ask, does it basically, does the share of the large firms, does it stay the same? Does it increase or does it decrease post-GDPR? And if it increases post-GDPR, then that's something that we would potentially worry about from a competition perspective, and certainly worry about it from a concentration perspective. So I'll walk you through how we go about doing this. For non-economists, these words may be a bit unfamiliar, but I think it's actually really intuitive what we're doing. So in order to measure this, we're going to look at reach, which is the number of websites using a vendor. And then we're going to define market shares as your own reach divided by the total reach of other firms in your category. And then there's this animal, which is the HHI, or Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is the sum of the squares of the market shares. And this is basically, this is just going to be an index that's going to increase as the relative concentration increases. So an HHI of 0 would be a perfectly competitive market, versus a HHI of 10,000 points would be a perfectly monopolistic market. And as I mentioned before, we don't observe any prices, so we're just looking at this network. So you have to understand the context of the results within that context. And finally, I want to go through this example here that walks you through just how this works. So in this example, we've got 3 websites, Site A, Site B, Site C. Site A and Site B are using Google Analytics. And so we're going to say their reach is 2. Site C is using Adobe Analytics, and so their reach is 1. And so we're going to say that Google Analytics market share is 2/3, and Adobe Analytics is 1/3. So that's, I think, very straightforward. To make things a little bit more interesting, or can give you another example where now Site B is not just using Google Analytics. They're using both Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. So now the reach for both Google and Adobe Analytics is 2. And that's going to mean that the market shares are 1/2. So that's, I think, reasonably intuitive that in some sense they have 1/2 of the market each. What's maybe unintuitive is you might say, well, Google Analytics kind of has 2/3 of the sites. And Adobe Analytics has 2/3 of the websites. So effectively, we've kind of normalized this so that this market share would add up to 1, and so that this Herfindahl index would make some sense. But what's going to happen here is websites use many different vendors. These market shares are going to be artificially depressed, even if basically everyone's using Google for their ad provider, it's going to decrease their relative market share to something below 10%. So now with that, to understand kind of what's going on in the background here, I'm plotting the relative HHI, or the concentration, over time. And you can see that this is basically the mirror image of the number of vendors that websites are using. So we get this peak 1 week post GDPR, and then this gradual descent more or less to the status quo. So, you know, really stark findings here, but that tend to erode. So this is like this kind of weird aggregate concentration metric. It's weird in the sense that like Google Analytics and Google Advertising is not really a competitor. So we want to try to break this up into companies that are actually competitors. And here we see a really large increase in concentration for advertising. So an increase of 25.3%. Hosting, audience measurement, and social media are more kind of modest. But collectively, these top four categories account for 94.3% of the vendors. So really, you know, we see an increase for all four of these categories, and they're basically almost all the story. You know, after that, the picture is more mixed, but, you know, these categories are really small. So the share is like 2% or lower, or 3% or lower of the third-party domains. So we haven't found like an iron rule here, but typically the large companies for these large categories are relatively better off. So just some sense of robustness and fleshing out these findings a bit more. So we also, you know, HHI is maybe not the most intuitive thing, but looking at market shares is a little bit more intuitive. So we look at the concentration ratio, which is just the sum of the top, say, 2 vendor shares. And by construction, this is going to line up with the HHI changes. One thing that I think that we add to again, I think the literature anyways, is I think really intuitive, and that's this notion of head-to-head competition. So what's going on here is if a website is using a dominant vendor and a competitor pre-GDPR, how often do they only retain the dominant vendor? So you've made a choice between these two. How often do you pick the dominant vendor? Well, in advertising, it's 98.9% for Google Ads. And for audience measurement, it's 93.5% for Google Analytics. And for Facebook's, it's 87.2%. So, you know, effectively, why are we getting these large increases in competition? It's because firms are really, really hesitant to let go of these behemoth companies. And then finally, we also show different market categorization according to some other authors, and we get broadly the same results. Any questions here before I go into some extensions?
I guess I have a question about the previous slide, which was that the HHI for advertising was pretty low, at least compared to all these other things. Like, yes, the difference was pretty large percentage-wise, but I guess I would have expected, maybe I'm reading this, I'm not sure, maybe I'm reading this in a weird way, but I would have expected a much higher HHI for, like, I would have expected Google to wildly be huge compared to everybody else. But is that, am I understanding the HHI correctly, or? Yeah, no, you're being, again, exceptionally observant. So what's going on here is kind of going back to this story. We have this nice market shares add up to 1. But when websites start using many firms, the market shares still add up to 1, but the Google share has gone from 2/3 here to 1/2 here. So what's happening is that websites are using on the order of, I guess it was 4, I told you before, ad companies each. And so even though something like 60–80% are using Google as the ad platform, Google's relative market share gets squeezed into something like 10–20%. So I see. Okay. That's exactly what's happening here, is that, like, these numbers are small. And I know, like, some law people find this very grating to say that, this market where Google has incredible control is very unconcentrated. I'm really not taking that position. I'm just saying,
you know, we should care about the relative changes, and this is really the number, but this is definitely weird for people to look at. And while we're at it, you know, one of the reasons why there's some weird stuff happening down here is that some of these companies or some of these categories effectively have like 2 or 3 dominant firms. And so like the max of HHI is 10,000. So you start to get these ceiling effects where some weird things start happening. And that's part of the story. So again, really great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful.
Cool beans. All right. So finally, for the concentration results, I want to walk you through 3 quick extensions that give you some intuition, more intuition about what's happening here. So the first thing we did is we classified the vendors that likely use personal data versus those that don't. And the way that we did this is we said, well, if you ever use a third-party cookie, then it's probably likely that you're using private information. And there's also some categories like audience measurement and website optimization that they need to use personal information, otherwise they can't do their jobs. So we're going to kind of put those into a batch and then put everybody else into a batch and then recalculate our HHI figures. And what we find is that there's a much larger relative increase in those websites that the vendors that likely use personal data versus those that don't. And we think this is important for a couple of reasons. One is that it's kind of a sanity check, like the GDPR should be affecting personal information. And sure enough, that's where we see the large decrease in vendors, but also a large increase in concentration. And the second thing, which is kind of concerning from a policy perspective, is that what this effectively shows is that the GDPR was supposed to regulate personal information and maybe improve privacy, but by increasing concentration, it's kind of concentrated the ownership of personal data into the hands of the larger firms. And to the extent that we think firms are able to use this data to create competitive moats around themselves, this may be kind of self-reinforcing that, you know, greater data ownership, relative data ownership may strengthen the relative position of these firms. Now, the second extension we looked at is the role of consent. And at the beginning of the talk, I said that if websites have to provide a list of firms that they're sharing the data with, that they're incentivized to provide a short list of recognizable firms. And this is actually backed up by user research. We don't see a movement here. So we look at sites that appear to be using a consent platform versus those that don't. And the relative difference is basically the same. And you know, the reason for this is that basically websites were burying the list of vendors under several clicks. So effectively, the user was not seeing a list of vendors like Google and Facebook and Adobe and all these other things when they first visit the website. So there's not really as much scope for this mechanism to have bite. Though the European regulator did recently confirm that they really need to be listing all the vendors, maybe not on the first page, but pretty easily for users to read. And then finally, we have the role of the 2 gorillas in this marketplace, which are Google and Facebook. Google has many vendors like YouTube and Google Analytics and Google Ad Manager. Facebook is just basically operating either as an advertising company or social media sharing company. And we see that with all the vendors, we have this result from before that concentration increases 17.3%. But when you get rid of these 2 vendors, then the concentration actually falls. So these 2 companies seem to be driving most of the results. One thing that Sarah may be noticing is that the concentration here, when you drop these 2 companies, falls a lot. So what this basically means is you've got 2 whales in a marketplace. And then once you get rid of those 2 whales, yes, there's kind of more room for everybody, but everybody is still, you know, relatively small fish. And this goes back to actually Gabe's question from earlier in the talk, you know, how big are these big companies? Well, enough that once you get rid of them, you know, everybody else is really quite small on a relative basis. So, you know, one thing that we get from this is this old adage that nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. maybe this needs to be updated to include Google and Facebook. All right, so any questions about the concentration results before I talk a bit about differences between websites? Thumbs up, cool. All right, so I'm going to show you some differences by website. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this drop that happened 1 week post GDPR, and I'm going to break it apart by different characteristics of websites. So for example, in this first figure, I'm breaking out that drop, that 1 week drop, by the share of users from the EU. So over here, we've got websites that have got between 90 and 100% of users from the EU. They have a drop of about 2 vendors and a bit. But down here, we've got websites between 0 and 10% of users from the EU, and they fall by 5, so more than twice as much. So one of the things that we find very compelling about this is that we would think it reflects the incentives of the GDPR that place a 4% penalty on global revenues. So this means that sites with few EU users have relatively little to gain in terms of revenue from the EU, but relatively more to lose from a penalty on their global revenues. So we think this is what creates this stark pattern, and it's actually kind of perverse because the GDPR is supposed to protect the privacy of EU users, but in some sense, the sites with the most EU users are doing less to protect the users than the sites that with fewer EU users.
Sorry,
So then,
quick question about the x-axis. Is this an estimation of the percentage of users of the total number of users in the EU who use the site, or is this the percentage of the visitors to the website that are in the EU?
what's the difference between those two? I think it's the
Sorry,
latter.
that is to say, if there's 100 people in the EU, this is estimating that we get 90 of those 100 users, or is it saying that we have 100 users who come visit our site and 90 of those users are from the EU?
It's the latter, yes.
Okay.
So these are sites, these are, primarily American and Canadian-based websites versus these are more European-based websites that get a lot of traffic from the EU. So good question. So
Can I ask a quick question also?
Yeah.
Before we go on, this is looking at the first week, right? So this isn't looking at prior to May 25th, 2018. So is it possible that like companies in the EU or sites based in the EU might have changed in advance so they wouldn't have as much of a change during this first week?
That's a fair point, and I'll show you some evidence on the next slide that may be consistent with that. I'd still be surprised if it's a matter of 2x. The differences really are pretty stark here, and I do think they do reflect the incentives of the GDPR. That these guys faced a much larger proportional fine than the sites over here. But it's a fair point, and that's something we should probably clarify in the paper. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
So I also had a sort of a similar question. I was trying. So what's the y-axis here? It's the average change in the It's like the drop in the number of vendors.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I'm not sure I understand the explanation you propose. So you said, like for sites with very few, actually maybe you can just walk through like your.
Yeah, let me give another kick at the can here, and hopefully this helps a bit. So like in another life, I do research on the value of cookies. And so I know from that research, and basically almost all the papers in that literature have shown that if you share cookies to the advertising infrastructure, you double or more your revenue. So if you think of these guys, if I'm a 100% European website and I stop sharing my revenue, stop sharing cookies, then I'm going to cut my revenue in half on the one hand, or I can potentially face a 4% hit on my revenues from the regulator. That makes skirting the law a lot more compelling because the economics are such that you are not in a great rush to comply with the law. Versus on this extreme, if you've got you know, 10% of users from the, well, let's say, yeah, 10% of users from the EU, then you're talking about sharing cookies, increasing your revenue by about 5% versus a 4% fine on your global revenues. So it's kind of 5% versus 4%. These guys are going to be much more aggressive about complying with the law. And then over here, I didn't mention, these are the guys that have zero traffic from the EU. These are websites that functionally are not subject to the law, most of them anyways, especially those that are from non-European language websites. And that's why you see this big discontinuity between the big drop over here and a small drop over here. Does that help the?
No, I get it. It all makes more sense. Sorry, I just I didn't read the minus signs, and I was like confused by the direction of the y-axis.
Yeah.
Was totally like there was this like total disconnect between what you were saying and what I was reading. But yeah. Okay, got it. Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. I could have been more clear. So yeah, I'm looking at this drop. And I'm breaking it apart by characteristics, and that's why this is negative and getting more negative.
And again, so regarding Jenny's question, so why is it that you think that right-hand scale is that the relatively small changes on the right are not driven by just the EU sites kind of seeing this coming and being prepared and having gotten their ducks in a row ahead of time?
It's a fair point that we should be more candid about, but we do see like a very stark difference in EU websites. So kind of going back to this pattern, if you look at basically every country, you see the very similar pattern of this dramatic drop that happens. But I'll show you on the next slide, reasons for Jenny's story. So,
okay. All right, thanks.
So yeah, we should be more clear about that. Thank you. All right, so here I'm just going, as I said, I'm breaking this apart by different variables. This is kind of you can see the plot, and here I'm doing it with a regression format. So I'll just walk you through what's going on in these results. So basically the results confirm what we showed you on the last page, which is that if you've got no EU users, then there's a big discontinuity between you and everybody else. But the more share of EU users, the less you comply, as defined by the less, the more vendors you keep post GDPR. And then, actually, this is in the paper, but I'll come back to it. So, and then this next set of results is about characteristics of the websites. So many moons ago, I suggested that websites with high revenue are going to be the sites that cut vendors the most in the short run. And the basic intuition for this is that if you're high revenue, it's optimal for you to engage more vendors. And so you just kind of have more fat to cut. And so we measure this in a few different ways. Traffic, which is the inverse of site rank. We show that that's positive. Ad counts, the number of ads on the website, you're cutting more vendors. If most of your users are coming from sites that tend to be richer, and so your ads are probably more valuable, then you're also cutting users more. So this is kind of this is more evidence in support of our results or our explanation that this is a function of websites' incentives and about their beliefs in the probability of enforcement. Now, I said that this was going to prove Jenny right, and actually I don't have them in this talk, but it's in the paper. So one of the things that is a bit odd here is when we focus on the websites that are from the EU, it turns out that websites that are more afraid of the regulator cut less than those that are less afraid of the regulator, which is the exact opposite of what you should expect would happen. And I think that that's actually a point of evidence in favor of Jenny's story. That I think if you're in Germany, you got your crap together before the last minute, but if you were in Poland, you kind of waited to the last minute. So so I haven't looked at that. The challenge, the EU versus US websites comparison is a little bit different, but I think, Jenny's criticism has some bite. So I want to come back to this, like, are you afraid of the regulator story with this last set of results? So here, previously I was focusing on the drop, but in the short run, And now I'm going to look at this post GDPR generally increasing trend to try to understand which are the websites that increase the number of vendors by more versus less. And so one example of this is this measure of, are you afraid of the regulator? And so the blue line is basically, you're not afraid of the regulator, and you see that there's this kind of rapid readoption of vendors that exceeds what you had before. And then the red line is you are afraid of the regulator. And then here you see the slope is much smaller, and you much more slowly get back to where you were before. So, where does this come from? Well, we noticed that after the GDPR, the average number of vendors grew slowly in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, but grew rapidly in countries like Bulgaria and Poland. This was kind of bizarre because the point of the GDPR was to harmonize regulation within the EU. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the GDPR is in part enforced at the country level. So we went out and we found this survey measure from the EU that measures regulatory strictness and is specific to data protection. And we found that regulatory strictness is negatively correlated with the post-GDPR growth in vendor use, just as I explained in this figure. So in the next slide, what I'm going to do is basically interact the growth by website and the number of vendors with various characteristics of the website. And once again, we find that regulatory strictness is negatively correlated. So websites facing stricter local data regulators, like websites in the Netherlands, keep vendor use low. And if you go back to our previous results, we think that high revenue websites should be dropping vendors more. Well, the converse is true as time goes on, because we expect that part of what's happening is that the probability of enforcement has fallen over time. So basically the sign of these things should flip, which is what we see for the amount of site traffic, which is inversely related to site rank. So we have to use site rank. We see it for ad count. We do not see the desired sign for user income. So this should be positive, but it's negative. And we think what's happening here is that user income is correlated with user demand for privacy. And so we think that sites in countries like Germany may be more willing to keep the vendors low. So all this is...
Sorry, quick question. Is there a correlation between regulatory countries that are more strict and their amount of EU usership? I would imagine that a website based in Germany has a more international appeal than one in Bulgaria, which might be my America-centric. I deal with the further west countries more often. And does that play into any of this, or is that kind of neither here nor there?
So sorry, are you saying that there's one possible confound, which is that large, wealthy European countries may be more cosmopolitan, have more traffic from other websites? I missed the first part of what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that's exactly kind of what I was thinking. That, I mean, Great Britain, companies in Great Britain, I don't know how, there was the split between regulatorily strict and lax. And I guess I have no mental conception of what that means, except that what you kind of had said, that Bulgaria, where I don't imagine kind of the websites based in Bulgaria are doing gangbusters business outside of Bulgaria, whereas the UK and France, where, French is spoken throughout the world, might have a very large amount of traffic from outside their country.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I should think a bit more about how that could bite us, because I agree that could be part of what's going on. I think that what helps us a bit is that the different European countries have different languages, such that it tends to make the traffic more specific to that country. And in this regression, we've also, it's kind of hidden in down here, is we're only looking at websites that have over half of their traffic from the EU. So effectively, on average in that sample, like 95% are going to be coming from the EU. But one thing we could try to do is drop the UK from this. Might be a sensible thing to do. Another thing that kind of speaks to what you're saying, but we haven't done, I think it's basically true that, like, we have data on the amount of employees and the general budget that the different countries have. for data protection. And we also know the amount of fines that these different countries have levied. So we could correlate that with our data protection survey, our strictness survey. We should do that, we haven't. I expect the correlation is going to be really strong, modulo some weird things, like some countries tend to give a lot of little fines versus some try to give some big fines. But yeah, I think that the survey metric was actually pretty correlated to what we've actually seen post GDPR. Cool. So I guess the takeaway from here is that we think that the beliefs provides evidence, and kind of going back to my earlier point, this is a hard thing to study for many reasons, one of which is it's hard to understand the effects of a law when the law hasn't been introduced. And so, you know, the reason why I'm really pushing on the regulatory strictness story is that we're really focusing on the results that are happening here in the short run. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that we think that this reflects the time where the websites were most afraid of the regulators, and therefore this is more indicative of the impacts of the law. It also is the case that because this sector just grows so much, it's very hard to make conclusions about differences far out from the GDPR introduction. It's much easier to look at kind of short changes nearby, and this difference is really stark. So I hope that this helps convince you that what we're finding is at least directionally indicative of potential policy concern. So in summary, the research question that I started out with is there a tension between privacy and competition policy? I actually neglected to mention that there hasn't actually been empirical work on that. So this has been like a really long-standing issue in this theoretical literature. It's something that policymakers have been concerned about, but hadn't been demonstrated with actual data. So we think that's one of the main contributions of the paper. And then kind of going back to our title, the GDPR has both intended and unintended consequences. On the intended consequence side, it did decrease rather the amount of vendor use and decrease the amount of data sharing about users, but it had some unintended consequences. The first is obviously we see this increase in vendor concentration, and in particular an increase in personal data concentration, which may reinforce the benefits to large firms. We see that sites with the most EU visitors actually reduce vendors by the least. So in some sense, they're providing the least privacy protection to websites with the most EU users. And we see that despite the fact that the regulation is supposed to harmonize regulation and enforcement across the EU, we do see the beliefs about regulatory strictness that are specific to countries tend to persist in how firms behave. And this is actually something that has been found in our other paper, as well as the paper I mentioned earlier about the effect on venture investments. It's a pretty robust finding of the literature. So finally, we have a bit more of the sense of why this is happening. So we know that it's largely because websites are choosing to keep with Google and Facebook because they just are leviathons and it's hard to do without. They provide a lot of benefits. We know that this is likely this tends to happen and specifically for personal data. And finally, this effect is happening without user consent playing any important role. All right, so that is it, and I appreciate your questions. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I guess I have a question. Is it sort of what is the lesson for other, you know, jurisdictions? Like as the U.S. looks at privacy, potential privacy regulations, you know, is the lesson that the net effect on how the web works was bad? You know, like sort of what, you know, concentration is sort of an indirect measure of quality of competition, right? And and the kind of the, like, I guess in some sense what would be great would be to measure like somehow the quality of the products being, like, maybe we're getting equally good marketing with less, you know, egregious privacy violations, or maybe we're not. Is there some sense of like what these various proxies, what we'd ideally love to measure if we had, like, you know, magic telescopes that could measure these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's sort of three things there. I think your question about like what is the ideal data here, like I think it would show some sort of quality adjusted demand for vendor services. My sense is that my sense is that the large firms are in part large because they have really good quality products, especially like if you're Google, they have most of the ad revenue. But that may be something that as a regulator we still are concerned about. We still want these large firms to be face competition from smaller firms to kind of keep them honest. So that's one response. Another is, what do we take from this? Well, I think right now we see a lot of interest in privacy, and we also see a lot of interest on the antitrust side of regulating these top two firms, these top tech firms. And I guess one message from this paper is that these two policy movements need to be in dialogue with each other because it does appear like there is some tension in the data. And then the final thing, what do we conclude about the GDPR? Well, I mean, I think we have to take all of the GDPR research, including mine, with a huge grain of salt because we haven't really seen much enforcement here. So, do we conclude that because we've just gone back to normal that the GDPR has had no effect? It's pretty unclear, given the regulator themselves are saying that this market has to change very drastically. So, I don't know. I guess the summary was I don't know. But very good question. Other questions?
You had a really interesting metric in there at one point that was like the head-to-head comparison, something. It was like of everybody who who had multiple vendors and then dropped down to one, how many picked the dominant one, and it's like 98% Google or something like that.
Yeah.
I guess do you recall from looking at this how many websites did go from N to just Google and Facebook? Like I kind of care a lot whether that number is like, oh, only 1% of them went down to just Google and Facebook versus, well, 98% of them went down to just Google and Facebook versus something else.
Yeah, I mean, so my sense from the data is that very few firms, at least when it comes to advertising, so on average you're using like 4 companies. So, the changes that we're seeing is you're sort of moving from 4 to 3 and you're kicking one out, but you're not kicking out Google. Right. It's kind of the story. So.
Well, I guess I'm just curious because some, like as you said earlier, some people had 2 advertisers or 1 advertiser. Some people had 200, or I forget what the max number was. Maybe that wasn't for advertisers. Maybe
yeah,
that was just
it's vendors in general. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was huge. So are the 200 people going down to 2, or is everybody going from 3 to 2, or are some people sticking with just Google and then the 200 people are going down to 198?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think was in some sense supposed to happen is that it was all supposed to go down to 0 without consent because my crawler is visiting all these websites without consent. And I think essentially what happens is like there's a trimming of the fat effect. So these websites, like the people get in the room, the engineers, the lawyers, and everybody, they review these different vendor contracts and they get a lot of value from these vendors. So they weren't going to kind of kick everybody out, but they kind of trimmed the fat. So vendors that they weren't very happy with their privacy policies or weren't very happy with the cost benefit analysis anymore, they kicked them out. So I think that's the best story. So we should think about, on average, we're seeing a 15% reduction and advertising is a 25% reduction. I don't think that's necessarily masking a lot of people going, 0 and a lot going, down 90%.
Okay.
Any last questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question going on your answer to one of the previous questions about how you opened up that there really hasn't been enforcement of the GDPR on these companies. So when you created the measure of strictness on each country, I was just curious if you could quickly elaborate a little bit more about what that strictness measure was and how you determined that that could be correlated to people's beliefs about that they would be fined when there really hasn't been any enforcement on this.
Yeah, that's a good question. It was pretty broken up, so make sure that I understood. I think you're basically saying, where do we get this regulatory strictness measure from,
Yeah.
and then how do we connect it? So the regulatory strictness measure is kind of good in some senses and not good in others. So it's pretty old. I want to say it's like from 2007, 2013 approximately. So it's a little old, but what they did is it's a European Commission survey, and they interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of companies in these different countries. So in each country, you get like 100 or 200 different companies, and they asked them, do you think your regulator is more strict than other regulators in Europe? And, a lot of them say they don't know, but a lot of them have opinions, and those opinions tend to trying to reflect what you'd expect, which is the Germans say, yes, Meg, we've got it really tough here. Whereas the Polish people say, it's not so bad compared to the Germans. So it's a hard thing in doing empirical work, like how do you quantify these things? And so we were very happy to find anything that would quantify. And then, then the question is, does this actually predict anything? And we were pleasantly surprised that there's a pretty big prediction there. So, what would be ideal is to see, what is the impact of like large scale enforcement in this area. Then we'd have a lot of data to look at. But absent that, we do think that these differences really speak to different beliefs about the probability that the websites are going to get hit by a fine from the regulator. So
thank you, that makes sense.
Best we can do. Great question. Any last questions?
Maybe I'll read the final question from Ron in the chat. A question of why is the number of vendors a good measure for what you're measuring here? Why not say the number of violation events?
So yeah, that's fair. So one of the kind of things that we're, there's a fair amount that we're kind of putting under large carpets or umbrellas in this paper. So I think fundamentally what the GDPR is about is like exchanging personal information. And one signal for that is cookies. And the patterns that we're seeing for vendors is very much the same for cookies. So you may even have larger drops in cookies. And the data that I showed you about concentration specific to companies that use cookies also speaks to that. So I agree that there's occasionally a mismatch, because when we're throwing these companies that aren't using cookies into the same thing, there's a good case to be made for us tossing them out. But in kind of the evidence, in trying to be as transparent as possible, we kind of show you everything at once. But yes, it's very much that personal data is being transmitted through all this stuff, and we're detecting that very clearly.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Garrett, for the outstanding talk on behalf of all the attendees.
Thank you. Thanks for the really great questions. This is actually some of the best questions I've got of any audiences. So I have to write a few things down after this. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks. And a reminder to everyone that this is a seminar series that occurs once every 3 weeks for the fall semester. So our next talk will be on September 30, and we'll send out the details on the Cyber Alliance mailing list. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks, Garrett.
I'll stick around for a couple minutes if anybody has any last questions.
That was fascinating. I got to run, but that was really cool. Thank you.
Thank you for the amazing questions. Sarah, you're fantastic. Thanks, Adam.
We think so too over in the security group. One point for the organizers, Mayank, I don't know if you're still listening, is about notifying people of the recording.
Yeah, I should have done that. I realized that too late.
I also don't understand why RA couldn't just like turn his camera and mic off, but like that's a different issue.
Yeah, I'll make sure that it's in the emails for the future, and also we'll try to crop out the beginning part where everyone introduces.
There's a Zoom setting where it forces people to click through like a continue button. If as soon as you turn on the recording, it says like this session is being recorded, and they have to click to continue.
Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah, I didn't set up
that
this,
way you don't have to remember to tell them.
Right, I didn't set up this this Zoom meeting info thing, so I will tell the folks who did to do that.
All right. Thanks again, Garrett. Bye bye.
This was a great talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks, you too. Bye.